Thor has come a long way since he was first introduced to the MCU, and we're not just saying that because he was forced to travel after Asgard was totally annihilated. We've watched him transform from a totally arrogant and self-absorbed character to someone capable of being truly heroic and selfless. But could there be another huge step in this hero's journey that we'll see play out in Avengers Endgame? In the very first Thor movie, it was clear Thor's purpose was to replace Odin as ruler of Asgard. Of course, this raises the question of where do gods go when they retire? But that's a question for another video. Today, we're going to be talking about a theory from Redditor Danish Royalty, which states that Thor might become the new All-Father at some point during Avengers Endgame. In order to figure out how this may factor into Thor's journey, let's take a look at what Odin has done so far. Odin has had a, let's say, complicated relationship with his kids. There was a time when we assumed Thor had always been his favorite, but Thor Ragnarok revealed he did have an original favorite child, his daughter Hela, and the two of them would laugh together as they rained destruction over the 9 realms. Just some real high-quality father-daughter bonding right there. But eventually, Odin began to feel slightly bad about all of the carnage they were causing, so he called it quits. It was around that time he realized he hadn't exactly made the greatest parenting decisions. In his defense, kids don't come with a handbook, so he went for a do-over, banishing his only daughter to hell and erasing any and all mention of her from Asgardian history. That's what we here on Earth call overkill. Then he decided to try again and had his son Thor, upon whom he pinned all of his hopes and dreams. Of course, he breezed over the part of Asgardian history where he trapped his last heir in hell. He also failed to instill any sort of empathy in his son, and instead chose to let him develop a massive ego, which went unchecked for quite some time. Oh, and he adopted Loki and pawned him off on Frigga. Seriously, this guy was All-Father of the Year. But while it's easy and fun to look back at the Mountain of Odin's mistakes, it's possible his actions were setting up some things to ensure Thor's future. During Ragnarok, we saw Odin pass away, and the whole thing was really abrupt. Even though Loki's spell had worn off, Odin opted to hang out in Norway, presumably brooding atop cliffs. Anyway, he just kind of announced he was shuffling off the mortal coil, and that his kids might want to watch out for their sister, and then disappeared. It seemed like such a simple death for such a powerful being. After all, Hela couldn't come back unless Odin was gone, and if she didn't return, Mjolnir wouldn't have been destroyed. While this was a sad moment for Thor, it was ultimately a good thing. If Mjolnir wasn't destroyed, Thor wouldn't have thought to create Stormbreaker, and if he didn't create Stormbreaker, he wouldn't have a weapon capable of defeating Thanos. And if Odin hadn't passed away, Thor wouldn't have ended up on Sakaar, which means Bruce Banner would have still been trapped there. Bruce Banner wouldn't have been part of Infinity War if it wasn't for Odin passing away when he did, which means Banner wouldn't have warned Doctor Strange about Thanos and he wouldn't be a part of Endgame. And if Asgard hadn't been destroyed, the Tesseract would have still been there, meaning Thanos would have had to invade Asgard directly, and that probably wouldn't have ended very well. Would Captain America and other participants in the Battle of Wakanda have been overwhelmed without Thor showing up to help? As odd and abrupt as Odin's death was, it's possible that it was an important part of Thor's journey and the fate of the MCU. Sure, Infinity War didn't play out exactly the way our heroes hoped it would, but it could have been a lot worse, and that's saying something, because seriously, that ended really poorly. In Doctor Strange, the Ancient One said she couldn't see past the moment of her own death. It's possible Odin couldn't either, and all of this was just fate or coincidence or whatever you want to call it. But Odin did show up to Thor in a vision after he died, so it's possible he had some inkling of what would happen. Thor isn't known for being the most brilliant guy around, but keep in mind there's a difference between being smart and being wise. Questionable parenting choices aside, it was this wisdom which inspired him to unite the 9 realms through peace instead of war. It's an important trait in a ruler, and something Thor definitely lacked when we were first introduced to him. But it's clear he's come a long way since then, and he seems to be less hot-headed and more contemplative with each film he appears in. Could Thor be slowly evolving into the kind of ruler that Odin was? There are some physical clues which suggest this as well. In the Marvel Cinematic Universe, Odin lost his eye during the Battle of Tonsberg while fighting with the Frost Giants. In the stories, Odin willingly traded one of his eyes in exchange for great wisdom. The MCU version is different, of course, but in both cases, Odin losing an eye represents him choosing peace and wisdom over war. Like his father, Thor also lost his eye while in battle, but although he lost something significant, he also gained a massive amount of insight into what's really important. He realized the true treasure of Asgard is its people, and that's what he must protect above all else. The stubborn, single-minded Thor we met in the first movie wouldn't have been capable of making a strategic retreat in order to ensure the safety of his people. Sure, he would have fought bravely, but he wouldn't have won, and all of his people would have been wiped out. Just like Odin, Thor lost his eye at a time in which he was forced to put the needs of his people over his own petty whims, vanity, and lust for battle. The end of Ragnarok was a huge moment for Thor, but true change takes time, and his progress was going to take a huge hit during Infinity War. We don't blame Thor entirely for his actions following Ragnarok. Sure, he's a god, but he still has feelings. He lost his father, brother, best friend, and home in quick succession, and to make matters worse, he could do nothing to prevent any of those losses. All he could do was stand by feeling completely helpless, and that's something hard to deal with, especially as a hero. But this caused Thor to revert to some of his troublesome behavior. His new friend Rocket Raccoon generously provided Thor with a shiny new eye, but really, it just seemed to symbolize him regressing to his old ways. After forging his new weapon, Thor confronted Thanos, and what he did next definitely didn't display any sort of great wisdom. It didn't even display common sense. A good rule of thumb, whether you're in a superhero film or a zombie flick, is to aim for the head. But Thor decided not to. He wasted time and energy on his desire for vengeance instead of the greater good, and he suffered an agonizing defeat because of it. It's something the old Thor would have done, and it enabled Thanos to win and wipe out half of all life in the universe. But we're not counting out our old friend Thor quite yet. We know that in the MCU, people rarely stay dead for very long, and the rules are even murkier when it comes to Asgardians. Hela was banished to Hell, but yet she managed to come back seemingly alive and well, chock full of terrifying powers. Odin perished during Ragnarok, but wasn't really gone. In Norse mythology, Odin was forced to die so he could be reborn and realize the full extent of his powers. In the Ragnarok prophecy, it was also foretold that Odin would meet a final end, but that he'd live on and be remembered by many. This cycle of death and rebirth is something we could definitely see taking place during Endgame, either literally or metaphorically. Sacrifice was a huge part of Infinity War, and we saw many characters giving things up. Even Loki turned over the Tesseract to Thanos in order to protect Thor. It wouldn't be unthinkable to imagine Thor might have to lay down his own life at some point during Endgame. But like the myth of Odin, it's possible he'll be able to be resurrected, reborn, or just walk right out of Valhalla. We aren't really sure what the Asgardian rules are, and Hela seemed to have no trouble with this. Plus, speaking of Loki, there's a chance Thor would be able to bring his brother back with him. If Odin had a rather abrupt death, Loki's was even stranger. Say what you will about Loki, but he's a pretty clever guy. Him trying to stab the Mad Titan with a knife just doesn't seem like something he'd do if there was no ulterior motive. If nothing else, Loki has always had a strong sense of self-preservation. Perhaps like Odin's demise, there was some reason Loki had to perish at that moment in time. If it's possible to pierce the veil between Valhalla and Asgard, then it's possible Thor could end up with access to some of the greatest warriors Asgard has ever known. That would definitely come in handy in Endgame. Actress Tessa Thompson has also been confirmed to be returning for Endgame, and it would definitely be interesting to see her reunite, at least temporarily, with her fellow Valkyries. If Thor is able to make it to Valhalla and return, this would put him in contact with Odin, Frigga, and possibly even Loki. At this point, it's hard to say where he might have ended up considering his history in the MCU. At the end of Ragnarok, Thor knew he would have to rebuild Asgard. Since the very foundation of his old home was no good, most assumed he'd have to find a new place to set up shop with the remaining Asgardians. But if Thor ascends to the next level of existence and becomes immensely powerful like Odin was, is it possible he could recreate Asgard instead of simply relocating? Many fans have been wondering what'll happen to the heroes who've been in the MCU for quite some time in Endgame. Will Steve Rogers heroically sacrifice himself in order to save somebody? Will Tony Stark retire in order to focus on his relationship with Pepper Potts and raise their adopted child, Peter Parker? Will Bruce Banner become Professor Hulk? Thor has been in the MCU for quite some time, and it might be time for him to take a step back as we introduce new heroes into the next phase of the MCU's movies. Ascending to All-Father status and ruling over Asgard would take Thor out of the daily fray of the Marvel Universe without getting rid of him entirely. After all, ruling over Asgard is definitely a full-time job. This might mean we see less of the God of Thunder, but it might also mean we could see more of some new, exciting heroes in the MCU. What do you think about the idea that Thor will become the new All-Father at some point in Avengers Endgame? Share your thoughts with us in the comments section below, and then click on that subscribe button for more videos from us here at CBR. We'll see you again next time.